Looking back at the Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype has always been nostalgic. This was the very first video game I was actually hyped for release. The press associated around Rayman had officials and fan sites constantly booming about this new game. In 2006, the internet itself was really starting to take off in the entertainment division, which explains why there's still a decent amount of coverage available for the original title. Unfortunately, this coverage is almost entirely exclusive to what we've seen via screenshots and trailers. All else that was publicly known was by word of mouth from the developers. As you know, the game that was teased to us never came to be. Instead, we got a minigame compilation that ended up being very successful for Ubisoft. Rayman fans that desperately wanted a new 3D platformer, however, weren't too pleased. I've seen it to be universally true that fans of the series would have preferred this assumed-to-be 3D platformer over the collection of minigames that eventually came out in late 2006. Fair warning before getting into this though, a lot of evidence used for this video relates to documents that go back to the past and the future, frequently in small periods of time. You could say the PR communication was a little messy, to say the least. Constant contradictions and misleading statements have however been tallied up using, essentially what is common sense. Yeah, to say this script isn't the result of many focused days and sleepless nights would be wrong. Nevertheless, in scouring hundreds of community-related posts, developer interviews, and press releases, I believe I have uncovered what is destined to be the closest we will ever get to exposing the mysteries behind the secretive game. Unless someday the prototype is leaked. So hold on to your seats, because this story is about to get rabid. Rayman Raving Rabbids is technically the fourth installment for the series, although as you may already know, Rayman 4 was not always a game focused on raving rabbits. No, before this, while Ubisoft was deciding who would take on the video game adaptation of Peter Jackson's King Kong film, they handed licensing rights for Rayman over to another team of developers known as Phoenix Studios. Thus, we get the earliest known developments of the Rayman 3 sequel project. However, this project was not a direct sequel to Rayman 3. It was, in fact, intended to be a spiritual remake of Rayman, a retelling, focusing on the lands of his past. Rayman would gather up with other Ubisoft heroes such as the Prince from Prince of Persia and Jade from Beyond Good and Evil in what was described as a training camp for video game heroes. According to Hubert Chevallard, an artist for the project who spoke in L'Histoire de Rayman, a book written by Michael Guarne, this first version of the game has an important narrative and dramatic tone. I cannot vouch for total authenticity, since I was using an online translator for the book. However, from what I gathered, it was about a young boy who had been wounded by a misfired gunshot that resulted in a removal of functionality for some of his limbs. He would reconstitute his body through dreamlike symbolic episodes with Rayman, a character of which he could relate to, as he too does not have a full body with working limbs. Whether or not these episodes actually took place in the boy's dream or not is uncertain. Perhaps midway through the story, a twist could be unveiled where the dreams were actually replacement hallucinations, whereas Rayman could have actually been his doctor. Series creator Michel Ancel has always said that Rayman is a character built for inspiration and creativity. This idea most certainly keys into that intended aspect of the character. I believe this world would also cut Rayman off from his previous story tie-ins, likely serving as no more than a limbless character with his own individual story within the context of this particular game's universe. Frankly, I'm not sure how other Ubisoft characters would fit into this context, other than being shoehorned in for potential sales. It's quite possible that I butchered this translation, however, if this was the true story behind the first iteration of Rayman 4, I think it would have been a great way to reintroduce the character to the world. What we know about Rayman 4's gameplay is quite limited. However, we do know that the game was intended to have costume transformations, similar, if not more complex than Rayman 3. Also, drivable sequences where Rayman could control various machinery, such as a Rayman-shaped submarine. In terms of fan reception, according to many Rayman fan sites, when this information was made public, fans of the series seemed skeptical on the entire approach of the game. However, it's not made clear how much these fans actually knew about the game at the time of their comments. Ultimately, this wouldn't even matter, as Rayman 4 was publicly scrapped by Ubisoft in May of 2006, a month after Ubisoft Montpellier got their hands on the new Nintendo Wii development kit. This was essentially the final nail in the Rayman 4 coffin. You see, there were suggestions floating around at the time that Ubisoft feared the Nintendo Revolution, as it was referred to at the time, now being the Nintendo Wii, would be incredibly successful. So successful that its launch could affect their previous gen titles that were still in development. If this is true, then it would provide a very realistic situation for Ubisoft's core administration to shift development to Ubisoft Montpellier, where they could develop the game for the new hardware they had received. Shortly after this, Michel Ancel just so happened to begin thinking of a way to bring Rayman to the Wii. Thus, the odds of this being a coincidence aren't likely. We now turn to the future comments made by the development studio of 2006's prototypical Rayman Raving Rabbids, who have on several occasions made interesting remarks that suggest the team behind King Kong had actually been connected with the development of Phoenix Studios' Rayman 4. To quote Xavier Poi on an interview, "The team has grown over the years with many talented people, but the core of the team has been working on video games since the beginning. That's how we were able to create the prototypes for the pre-production of Rayman very quickly, keeping in mind that work on Rayman started around the same time as King Kong, and we were able to pick up the pace as soon as King Kong was finished, in order to be ready to bring out the game on the new generation of consoles for this Christmas." Can we trust Xavier? Well, consider there's virtually no reason for Xavier to be lying about this information, especially considering that in the gaming industry, more time spent in development equals more content created. This lie would only set them backwards regardless of how much work was done, so Xavier's words must be true. The earliest documentation I could locate for the King Kong game announcement was April 14th, 2004. That's the same day it was announced that Ubisoft had obtained the rights to make the video game based on the film. 6 months later, in October of 2004, a new announcement sheds light, being that Ubisoft Montpellier would begin starting development for the game. Phoenix Studios had begun working on their earlier Rayman 4 project at some point in 2005. So, if King Kong began around the time Rayman 4 did at Ubisoft Montpellier, it would have only been so if Phoenix Studios' Rayman 4 was under direct consolation from the team in Montpellier. Therefore, with the words of Xavier in mind,
keeping in mind that work on Rayman started around the same time as King Kong, the
link between the two games becomes solid. King Kong's development began in 2005, as confirmed from developers of the game. For that, we have no definitive date, but the start of a new year seems a very appropriate time for the start of a new project. Without any way to know for sure, we can only point to the most realistic date being January of 2005. This can be backed up by crossing evidence between a short sentence in L'Histoire du Rayman and the date of Phoenix Studios' Rayman 4 cancellation. In L'Histoire du Rayman, the idea of the Rabbids is stated to have been held on hiatus for more than a year until they had started actually working on this new version of the game. That means the Rabbid had been created earlier into the project but was held on said hiatus until Phoenix Studios was removed from the project, giving the current status of work to Montpellier, where their idea would be the new basis of storyline instead of having a dramatic tone, being more comedic, particularly parodic of sci-fi horror flicks. In the September issue of 2006's Nintendo Power, Mitchell states that there's been a recent wave of cartoons designed for adults. I'm not talking about sex and things like that, but the content. It's not the sweet, typically kiddie cartoon characters, it's bizarre and slightly disturbing. It's funny for the kids and the adults. Such genre has more recently been termed as infiniction by yours truly. Unfortunately, the direct source for the following had been lost in making this video, but I read an interview where Michel Ansel stated the idea for the Rabbid character was considered earlier in the Rayman 4 project, but for whatever unknown reason, this never panned out. It's been said that Phoenix's game did not have an actual antagonist yet, which is likely why Michel decided to go back to the drawing board, so to speak. Phoenix had one idea with Dark Rayman from the first Rayman game, but that was intended to serve only a small portion of the game, perhaps if even for just a single mission. Because of Michel's ambitious entry in presenting the character to the studio, which we will analyze shortly, they were thinking of including the character somewhere as an Easter egg. If anybody recalls exactly where this information came from, do feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'll pin it for everyone to see. So, does this mean that the Phoenix Studios game was definitively turned into what Ubisoft Montpellier would then afterwards take on to become Rayman Raving Rabbids? True, their division was busy working on King Kong at the time. Too busy to work on it, but too busy to provide insight and ideas? I think not. Michel Ansel had on several occasions mentioned his dreams of bringing Rayman back to his roots, returning to the wacky worlds of Rayman 1. He eventually made this dream come true in Rayman Origins, but looking back, is it really a coincidence that these wacky worlds appeared to be the same locatives demonstrated for Phoenix's Rayman 4? In case you didn't know, Michel Ansel had little to practically no involvement with the creation of the previous game, Rayman 3. He only played a hand in modeling Rayman and gave various suggestions via brainstorming sessions, such as with enemy designs and locations. If Michel Ansel brainstormed characters and environments for Rayman 3, it isn't far-fetched to believe he did the exact same thing for Phoenix Studios' Rayman 4. After all, in looking to the future, when the 2006 Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype had to be given up, Michel Ansel left the production and is only credited in character designs for the final game. Very similar to his contributions on the earlier mentioned Rayman 3. You know what they say is true, history repeats itself. So at this point in the timeline, we got Phoenix Studios working on their game, whereas Michel Ansel is taking a train ride to Paris for a reunion he had coming. On this ride, he hatches the idea that he'd like to see in Phoenix's game to serve as its main antagonist. By inspiration via a scene with a killer rabbit in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Michel Ansel draws a rabbit on a sketchpad. As L'Histoire du Rayman puts it, Michel bursted into the studio that day saying, "Guys, forget the accident. The rabbits have lived underground for too long in their burrows. They've come back to the surface and they are not happy. Forget the accident being whatever fate was bestowed upon the young boy in the story of Phoenix Studios' Rayman 4. As we know, it wasn't a success at the time, but with the cancellation we then get this new focus, being Rayman Raving Rabbids. While editing this video, I found another useful piece of information from the game that refused to die. As it turns out, the original Rayman 4 project had been picked up yet again in 2007, where it was then cancelled again in 2009. Not much is known about this prototype era, but what we do know is that there was another character in the game known as CL, a human who would have played alongside Rayman. However, we know very little about this role. The original Rayman 4 was then publicly confirmed to be cancelled in May, the same date of that year's E3 presentation. And so what was seen here in the E3 trailer was the result of a single month, give or take, of work from Ubisoft Montpellier, taking assets from Phoenix Studios' game, but with an entirely new implemented plot, focusing on what they would go on to call the Raving Rabbids. As a result, Phoenix Studios was pulled entirely from the project. Having previously developed games like Pet's Rescue, Pet's Horse Club, and the video game for the Arthur and the Invisibles 2 film, Rayman 4 was their most ambitious project to date. As unfortunate as this cancellation was for them, this could be seen as an event which benefited the game's forthcoming development. While Phoenix Studios did have a resume established to present for new publications, their resume was cluttered with shovelware, which wouldn't help them in finding the assistance they needed to continue. They then end up closing shop in 2009. Michel Ancel and his team continued the development of Rayman 4 by using what they saw as good, booting out what they saw as bad, and throwing a whole lot more in between. Before we move on, we need to take a quick look at the Game Boy Advance game. The Nintendo DS game is also quite important in this aspect, but since this came out later, it's not relevant quite yet. We'll get to that one in time. The Game Boy Advance game was actually the very first take-home impression from the Rabbids, as the main game came out 5 days later for the Nintendo Wii. It came to several other consoles within the span of a year, after an exclusivity deal fell through. Yep, at one point Rayman Raving Rabbids was exclusive to the Nintendo Wii. Essentially once they had decided to make that big transition from the prototype to the final game, as mentioned in the Nintendo Power issue. But what of that transition? The Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype was anticipated by fans to be a 3D platformer, with words from the development team themselves promising such a game. Albeit no solid proof outside these claims would yet be able to confirm this. The Rayman 4 before it was known to be a 3D platformer on the PlayStation 2, but the transition to the Wii hardware with the Rabbids in mind seemed to also change the tone and general style of the game. One might think development had started over entirely, but many signs point to this not being true. Many ideas were brought over from the initial Phoenix iteration of Rayman 4, so much so that you could classify Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype as an evolution of the inspirations from Rayman 4. It's worth noting on the side that the game was no stranger to King Kong assets, which had been created for use in a dark and gloomy island, likely being why such a change of tone had been created for the new game. This content was already optimized for consoles, whereas the status of Rayman 4's optimization is unknown. It had possibly not even yet been made playable on the PlayStation 2's hardware it was going to run with. Ties from the King Kong game can even be found in the final game, where the animation for a bat creature is unashamedly reused for the Bat and 2 Rayman Raving Rabbids minigames. Having this demo footage at E3 exclusively take place in these dark environments was likely a result of cleverly reusing resources at the time. This also leads to the suspicion that at this time, what we saw might have essentially reflected all that really existed at that point. Reused elements were a theme for the prototype, most likely due to the closing-in deadline of the Nintendo Wii's launch. They even centralized the game on familiar models of the Rabbids, as to remove the need of making a huge roster of new enemies, rather dressing them up in various costumes or slightly altering their existing models and textures for an acceptable new design, as was stated by Florent Sacre, a designer or artist for the game in L'Histoire de Rayman. It was a smart move to plan these things ahead of time, but as we will later figure out, even these efforts couldn't save a game that was far too ambitious for its schedule. It was clear that new content had been created for the game, as evidenced in this collection of screens. One could wager, however, that some of these ideas might have been created for use in King Kong but were scrapped. Various creatures like this realistic spider, that we will address later on, don't fit in with the overall theme of Rayman's world. At this point, there might not have been much more to the prototype than Rayman's set of mechanics, the mountable characters, and, in part, the Rabbids' colonization. This wouldn't deny a world full of color beyond what was presented. Outside a central hub could very well have existed the rest of Rayman's colorful home world after being taken over by the Rabbids. There's a comment from Michel Ancel out there that brings relevance to this potential idea. Quote, "Our game has been invaded by thousands of raving mad and vicious bunnies who have apparently been preparing for this assault since the very first Rayman game." You don't say. No, not for centuries, not since the hoodlums, since the very first Rayman game. Such a prejudice sounds oddly specific, especially considering how much of an influence the first Rayman game's environments were on the cancelled Phoenix Studios game. Beyond Rayman 4, and even Rayman 3, we have further proof lying in the Game Boy Advance version of what was their upcoming game. So what's the deal with this portable game? What is it, and how different is it from the console game? Well, pretty much everything. This actually ended up being a traditional 2D Rayman-styled Game Boy Advance platformer, as was the case with Rayman 3 from years before on the same handheld console. Before we delve into why this game turned out to be what it is, we need to address this one pertaining question. Who developed the Game Boy Advance game? This was from a third-party developer known as Visual Impact Productions. So why was it a 2D platformer? Because, naturally, Visual Impact Productions was tasked to create a Rayman game that was indeed a platformer. What renders eligible as proof of this is a statement Michel Ancel made about the prototypical game in a celebrity interview event with associates from the Jeux Video magazine, where he talks about Rayman, in tandem mentioning the Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype. He says their team didn't have enough time to make the 3D platformer they wanted to in order to meet the launch date of the Wii and to receive Christmas sales for the game. There are two very important ideas to take away from this statement. Firstly would be the exact reason why Rayman Raving Rabbids turned into a minigame collection rather than what was anticipated to be a platformer. To put it simply, and to phrase earlier, they did not have enough time to create the game they wanted to meet Christmas sales that year that they were relying on for a big push of its profitability. Secondly, this proves that Ubisoft Montpellier did not have the extra time to create ports to the handheld systems as they had promised. So, midway into development, they hired a third party to handle the Game Boy Advance port. The work that went into this didn't change the fact that Ubisoft Montpellier couldn't even finish their intended base experience on time. As such, the Visual Impact Productions game came out as was expected from them. The port featured Rayman visiting nostalgic worlds from his past. However, instead of the story Phoenix Studios came up with, Rayman's home world would have been invaded by the Rabbids. And, just as Michel Ancel said prior about their prototype, our game has been invaded by thousands of raving mad and vicious bunnies who have apparently been preparing for this assault since the very first Rayman game. Around this point in time, a second trailer for the Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype had surfaced, which featured no actual gameplay, only a cinematic. At the start of this trailer, we see recurring series characters known as Teensies run away from the Rabbid invasion. And it just so happens that in the Game Boy Advance port, the first task is to free Teensies from captivity of the Rabbids. This implies that this teaser trailer was revealing a game that would follow the Game Boy Advance game's story, of course to a much larger scale. As such, Ubisoft Montpellier had attempted to retcon the developments of Rayman 4 with Rabbids at the last minute for their console game to speed up the development time and resources in order to meet schedule. We already have a history of the series throwing multiple ideas into one to meet with consumer demands, such as the eerily similar event with Rayman 2's late Game Boy Advance entry that had been spun into a Rayman 3 adaptation last minute to tie in with advertisements and relevancy of the then upcoming Rayman 3. It's safe to say that these coincidences are not coincidences. L'Histoire de Rayman provides one final fact we need to close up the confusion between Rayman 4 and Rayman Raving Rabbids. Quote, this prototype retains some features from the original Rayman 4. In closure, put simply, this adaptation of Rayman Raving Rabbids did indeed retain work from the productions at Phoenix Studios. Here's a fun fact. Did you know that the GameCube and Xbox were planned to also have ports of Rayman Raving Rabbids, but they were scrapped because the window of submission had died out for both consoles, meaning Nintendo and Microsoft were no longer taking in publishments for their soon-to-be expired consoles. There was also supposed to be PSP and PS3 ports. The PSP platform to get a similar experience to that on console, as was equally done with their King Kong game. The PS3 version would have come after the Xbox 360 version, which was already a year late to hit the shelves. No official word exists on this, but rumor has it the port did not sell well, and with being so dominant on the Wii, they saw their efforts in developing for a platform notoriously difficult to program for a complete waste of time. Not to mention the Wii sold like hotcakes, so a very large part of their target demographic was already on that platform. While only so much has been leaked about the Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype story, we can still piece together a rough example using concept art, teaser footage, elements from the two inspired handheld games, and discoveries made post-release by the community. But even still, we'll have to fill in the gaps ourselves for a couple entirely undocumented areas. First off, it might be smart to analyze a theory posted on the Rayman PC community by user Birds858. Bird's theory was based on the game being a party game throughout all segments of development. This research they did for their post is certainly helpful in the discovery of whether this game was indeed a 3D platformer or not, however it's still ideal to be skeptical of third-party theories. The post suggests elements from the prototype were repurposed, such as Rayman fighting Rabbids being bunnies have natural rhythm, Rayman running a set linear path becoming bunnies don't give gifts, Rayman on the spider becoming the racing minigames, and Rayman on the eagle becoming bunnies don't like bats. While this is confirmed to be true, reused elements don't necessarily confirm, or in that case even deny, a complete change of playing style. The post then suggests original tags from the Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype era website that was found by a member known as Drooly. Some of the various tags were platformer, adventure, action, and minigame. Next to this, Birds mentions the plot in which Rayman, his previous enemy Andre, and the girlfriends of the two were captured by the Rabbids. Don't worry, we'll get into that later. Whereas Rayman must then compete with Rabbids in minigames to become more popular than their leader, a spoof of Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars being called Jabbit. They would then try to escape with his friends, similarly to the final game's plot, without this Jabbit character, who could have easily been replaced with the single Sergway Elite Force Trooper we know in the final game. We then see several pieces of concept art meant to demonstrate these gameplay elements. If Birds is right, it puts a rather large twist in the original prototype conception, meaning it was a party game all along. With the research and production made towards this video, I now have a conclusion to this theory. First of all, a large portion of evidence posted here relies on concept art for the game. This art is official, as it has been shown during interviews with Michel Ancel, and some of it is found in L'Histoire de Rayman. That said, however, we have no way to decipher when exactly this concept art was established in development. Until the issue of Nintendo Power I ordered came in. Then all my concerns were over. This issue came out well after the transition, using art that was relevant at that time. What's more, in these images it implies that Rayman has gained some popularity over time. Sure, his environment gets fancier in the final game as well, but several comments made in the issue imply that there was much more going on surrounding this concept. Michel reveals some more information here, like how the Rabbids would make Rayman participate in various trials for the Rabbids' entertainment. Rayman would become increasingly popular among his captors. This is something we do not experience to any degree in the final game. There's a suggestion in the magazine that Tarzan from Rayman 1 would be a playable character at one point or another, being one of the captors who would play the first-person shooter segments. Perhaps a knock at Ubisoft's Far Cry games that typically take place on an island, as the shooter level he was demoed with took place on an island. Eventually, Rayman would realize that if he could soar above the ranks, and become even more famous than the Rabbids' morbidly obese and sadistic emperor, he may be able to free his people. Nonetheless, at this point, the decision was indeed to make a party-based game. These images are meant to reflect that, but even still, the game was intended to be a lot more than what it turned out to be. I reached out to Stephen Thomason, the man responsible for the article in Nintendo Power. He was able to tell me a couple more things about his experience during the initial interviews. One of the first things I asked him about was these demonic runts that appear in the final game, and in the Nintendo DS game. He said that while Michel never talked about them specifically, he had a lot of plans originally for this platforming game, as he referred to it, with different story elements. Steven said this theme was at a couple of different points in the demo he saw, so it could have been an important part of the initial story. He then went on to tell me that the rideable creatures, like the spider, eagle, and so on, would surprise him if they were truly in a playable state. He then says Ansel and his team had plans for the game that were much more ambitious than what we ultimately got. I suspect they just ran out of time and Ubisoft really wanted to have the game out for launch. The original vision for the game was much more ambitious. There were tons of concepts and character art for stuff that never made it into the game. That's not entirely uncommon in game development, but I think massive sections of Rayman Raving Rabbids had to be cut due to time constraints. I remember reviewing the final game months later and being sort of shocked at how bare bones it was compared to what the team had told me they planned for it during my visit for the cover story. Steven did answer a few more questions I had, though most of those answers we already knew. My intention was to get a bit of a grasp on whether this was ever truly a platformer in the first place. After all, the only basis we have is what's been said during the game's development, which heavily insinuates it was not the minigame collection we know today. Surrounding many topics and questions by video game journalists, exists a simple answer to every 3D platforming related question. Quote, the game will be open, you can navigate freely and move from situation to situation thanks to your different companions, objects, or creatures of the shadows. But if you're not sold yet, I don't blame you. Upon first hearing Rayman could make it from quote-unquote situation to situation, I was a bit skeptical. To me, that sounds like making your way from one minigame to another minigame within a central hub world as the arena was in the final game. After all, Rayman is in a freely open environment in the final, however there's nothing to do within it other than run from, as said about the prototype, situation to situation. Ultimately, there were never segments of the teasers that would directly suggest its 3D platforming basis without any room for doubt. All we had seen is Rayman undergoing various tasks taking place in the 3D world, but the availability of the footage was restricted to what could be defined as mini arenas and linear stage paths, something the final game is no stranger to. With the question lingering of whether this was a 3D platformer or not, I began to search around in hopes of coming to some sort of conclusion. While the answer to this is quite simple, coming to the conclusion without any room for doubt proved to be difficult, mostly due to conflicting statements from different people working on the game. My speculation on why that happened is because the team was split into various subdivisions, where the latest and greatest news on the game might not have been elaborated well between others, as what they were currently working on would have still been in the game whether they changed the formula or not. Those people would be those working on game development such as character modeling, mounting mechanics, among the likes of other technical details that don't much require the knowledge of how the 3D universe would be tackled outside of its internal gameplay functions. So where else do we go from here for a confirmation? Well, that seems to lie within the costumes, dancing, and creatures of the night. Several comments made about these elements imply that they were of universal context. In the final game, where certain abilities are restricted to certain playstyles and minigame types, these powers were, like in Rayman 3, subjective to terrain that would consistently benefit from them. We weren't told about a first-person shooter segment, a way to pick up pigs, a dental occupation, a dancing club, a water gun filled with carrot juice. They would never tell us about these individual things because the way that could be implemented into a 3D world is very limited. To think the prototype's exposure was a reflection of the final game, whilst thinking it was indeed a minigame-focused title, would imply the game only consisted of a small few playstyles for the span of the entire collection. That would not be an easy idea to sell off for a full retail price. Then what if there were in fact hundreds more ideas that they just weren't telling us about? What if these ideas were selectively chosen to build hype for their ability to relate these moments to the new motion-controlled hardware? Well, a closing argument can be found by a comment made by Michelancel. Quote, "This new Rayman will be an action-adventure game for one player. For the moment, we have no plan to integrate a multiplayer mode, and we want to focus on an excellent solo experience." So with confirmation from the team itself, and multiple elements that would make more sense in the context of a game that wasn't centered around minigames, the odds of it not being a 3D platformer at this point would be very, very slim. Framerater will return after these messages.
Rayman contre les lapins crétins. Plus de 70 épreuves vraiment délire. Éclate-toi jusqu'à 4 joueurs. Rayman contre les lapins crétins. La lymph invasion a commencé.
And with that said, we're brought back to these concept images for the game. Could these possibly classify as minigames? Sure, one could suppose. There is this one suspicious O Fortuna countdown theme in the game's files that could have been used for the start of a minigame, but who knows how important that small clip would serve in the whole scheme of it. We have to consider something here. When a large portion of your minigames are classified as 3D platforming, if not all of them, besides these dancing games I suppose, then does this stay classified as a minigame collection, or can it be classified as a 3D platformer? In a way, you could compare this to segments of Rayman 3, where Rayman would quickly race around the 3D environment next to his own shoe. Would you really classify these as minigames? When I look at it, I just see a diverse selection of stages. One acre to another, new situation, all if not most pertaining to the basis of what the game is, a 3D platformer. Of course, I won't deny the clear possibility of these being minigames, but they would have been played in a far less traditional sense than what we got. Let's take a look at the Nintendo DS game for a moment. This title was based on the prototype and released several months later. This gave Ubisoft time to make the game they wanted rather than focus on an idea that they could ship out for launch and Christmas. It was a side project that was in no way a rush, coming out in March of the following year, by no means a production time that ensured any sort of financial advantage. Nevertheless, look at how Rayman makes it from level to level here. It all takes place within a coliseum where Rayman makes his way from situation to situation. But they don't all take place immediately in that location. Rayman uses the coliseum as a level selection screen, as could be a 3D hub world in the 3D platforming game. So Rayman could go from this hub world to many different locations. That does make it sound awfully similar to the final game, but note that in the DS release these access different levels. You might be thinking, what evidence supports this also being the case with the 2006 prototype? Earlier we mentioned about how Phoenix Studios' Rayman 4 had costume transformations in it. This is another idea that carried over to the Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype, albeit perhaps to a smaller scale. It's hard to say whether these conceptual transformations had all intended to make it past the drawing board, but whatever the case, they set the foundation for what would be used in the 2006 prototype. In this prototype, Rayman would be able to host a number of outfits that would give him the ability to unlock various new locations. Both comments made at interviews and the role these costumes serve in the eventual Nintendo DS port support this theory. As far as has been suggested for the prototype, these costumes would have been handled a bit differently than what had ended up in the Nintendo DS port. The port was developed by Ubisoft Sevilla, all things considered, but being within the branches of Ubisoft, I'd imagine this wouldn't have been too different in the hands of Montpellier, whom of which probably submitted the design documents to them. Conceptually, certain Rabbids were able to be hypnotized under certain personality types, associated by specific costume types. Not all the Rabbids will like disco music, as not all the Rabbids will like gothic music, and so on. Rayman would use these costumes to disguise himself as a popular icon, in this case anyone who isn't Rayman, and dance along with it to hypnotize specific Rabbid types. No, the concept itself doesn't make much sense, but Michel Ancel made it quite clear on multiple occasions that this game was intended to be very nonsensical and silly. Rayman would then be able to use the abilities of certain Rabbids to unlock new areas, all thanks to his attained musical talents from the costumes Rayman would have to locate throughout the course of the game to progress. Essentially, this would have worked the same way as nozzles in Super Mario Sunshine, where objectives were clearly visible the whole time, you just couldn't get to them without fulfilling a certain objective that would reward you with a new ability. Many games do this, like in this lesser popularity example Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, which uses specific boomerangs to open a path to a new world. Michel Ancel himself essentially confirms this when comparing his written interview with an official press document that was said to have been presented alongside the Rayman Raving Rabbids booth at E3 2006. While he likely wrote the document there, since it so closely reflects his interviews, he wasn't actually present at E3 that year. He states this himself in a ridiculous parody skit he created for E3 at their development villa, inspired by the infamous scene from Monty Python which inspired the Rabbids themselves. While he couldn't make it to Los Angeles, he was able to answer online interviews that were requested of him, which is how we get the information that lines up with the press document at the E3 booth, implying he was otherwise still involved with the booth. We've seen the costumes from their presentation in the trailer, but you wouldn't use exclusively these to get to new places. The game also featured creatures that you could tame under certain circumstances, which is shown briefly a bit later into the trailer, but more specifically with released screenshots of the game that surfaced online the same day. This can be compared to the Rayman gear Rayman accesses later into the Nintendo DS game that isn't a costume but a separate entity that allows Rayman to access new areas, as very well could be the role of these creatures once tamed in the prototype. Such creatures included sharks, eagles, spiders, a rhino, and even an angelfish apparently, which was probably confused for an anglerfish as seen in this promotional artwork for the game. In the Nintendo Power magazine, it states multiple times over that the game was intended to be a 3D platformer from the start, and a direct source, Stephen Thomason, was there to prove these words were in fact spoken by the dev team. That's just if you didn't already believe it from the multiple interviews. As the community has in the past considered these to potentially be lies. But nope, it was true. Rayman 4, as it was a 3D platformer that had changed to a party game shortly after receiving that Nintendo Wii development kit. There's far too many consistencies from multiple sources to figure this was always a party-based game. Interestingly enough, when the game was swapped to its party focus, it was still to retain many, if not most, elements from its prototype. Michel Ancel actually promises that the final version of the game will boast interactive environments and fully destructible obstacles, at least regarding one of the Warthog racing minigames. But this idea probably reflected their goal as a whole. He later states some of these trials could even be their own game. Speaking of which, just because platforming won't be the main attraction in Raving Rabbids, doesn't mean it won't have a place in the game. Ancel promises to sprinkle quite a few full-fledged platforming trials throughout the adventure. Quite a lot of promises from Michel. Could this be part of the reason why he left development of the game before it released? Seems quite probable that he was becoming more disappointed in how a lot of his dreams had to be scrapped for the deadline. He's later admitted to a large portion of it having to be removed, which he, in a very conspicuous way, says may be able to return someday in the future. I should mention one thing that might as well be considered an inconsistency in the Nintendo Power magazine, since it's relevant in the moment. In this issue, Michel Ancel says nothing about their gameplay swap being the result of time management. Quote, "It's so different from the other consoles that we decided to reconsider everything," Michel said. "Even if it could have been a good game, we didn't want to create a traditional platformer." Now, despite this, I don't believe what Michel is saying here. I don't really consider them quote-unquote lies. I believe these are more exaggerated truths. They were selected for the Nintendo Power magazine, which is a big promotion, so of course they would speak favorably about the Wii, and try to steer clear of talking negative about anything surrounding it. Had they actually talked negative about the experience, it may also affect the sales. It's possible that this being the cover story for the issue was established purely due to the strong relationship between Nintendo and Ubisoft, so Montpellier surely wouldn't want to do anything that could break this bond. Michel was disappointed that they couldn't create their platforming game, later stating that he actually felt somewhat forced into this situation with this hardware that they felt obligated to make proper use of in a game that was anticipated to launch with the system. Unfortunately, we have no way of proving this is true, but we are able to see that Michel had two different answers to this question over time. One of them is true, and I suspect the truth lies in his disappointment, thus leaving the game behind. So what can we take home from this? The Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype was a 3D platformer, undoubtedly, but one that focused on a lot of different themes, like beat 'em up, stealth, and even the occasional racing. It also had minigames, however unlike traditional minigames, these would be integrated into the game as gameplay set pieces, rather than dedicated outlets for specifically scripted game sequences. So yes, they were they were games, but in this prototype they were meant to be much more than that, and did not take a central focus like was the case in the final release. So what about the game's plot? Probably the most difficult aspect of narrowing down the official story for Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype is that so many ideas have been changed throughout the course of the game's development. Most prominently, character roles. One noteworthy example is Sergei, who in concept art is labeled as big and scary. This powerful bunny is part of the elite force and he doesn't take any nonsense. He uses his big hands as his weapon of choice. But in the official game's manual, it states that Sergei is a big softy who is a pleasant companion and cracks light tricks such as cracking his knuckles, or playing this little piggy with your toes. Strangely enough, even this depiction doesn't seem to be accurate, as Sergei is not gracious in the slightest, at least at the start of the game. Yes, he warms up over time, but these early signs are by no means the indication of a big softy. There are a lot of inconsistencies like this, but for the sake of time, we'll only take a look at what's genuinely important here, and what can be most likely attributed to the prototype's era of development. The first portion of the story is exposed via the Game Boy Advance version, where Rayman is enjoying some time off until a group of uncontrollable rabbids attack him off guard. Some standard rabbids, one of the smaller pink variant of Rabbid, and zombie rabbids, as well as a giant rabbid ship lurking in the background which are apparently used for transporting prisoners. I'd like to direct you to an interesting comment made by Michel Ansel during a developer interview. He claims that, quote, fans of the series will find most of the characters they loved, but in new situations, just because the rabbits are going to use them for, strange purposes, I can't tell you anything just yet. Michel Ansel would later reveal these strange purposes in L'Histoire de Rayman as kidnappings, stating the rabbits would steal, then package up Rayman's friends and sell them, which as he stated represents their industrialization of Rayman's world. Rayman would have likely tried to set his friends free by evading what the game called Inspector Rabbids, until he would have been caught. Future developments in the game suggest he wouldn't immediately leave the clutches of the Rabbids, so it's likely he didn't break free as quickly as he does in the toned-down Game Boy Advance version. Interesting side note, these aforementioned Inspector Rabbids had a lot of design changes throughout the game's development. In the end, the model was warped to become this demonic-looking elephant creature that you inexplicably see throughout the course of the final game. A very similar model appears in a minigame featured in Rayman Raving Rabbids 2, but upon attempting to replicate this, I wasn't able to spawn in that model, which could very well have been a placeholder and this was just a pre-release screenshot. Rayman shortly after encounters a pink rabbit who confronts him with a robotic version of an anti-tune from the first Rayman game, implying again they have been paying attention to Rayman since his first game, studying his foes and learning from them to replicate the horrors in their own twisted way. Now, in the Game Boy Advance version of the game, Rayman meets up with Lee the Fairy here and heads to a village where Lee tells him what the situation is with the rabbids and why they're up to no good. However, I think this was a way of scaling down the experience for the handheld. The prototype implies far more happened while Rayman was captured, such as quote-unquote blood sports with other rabbids, racing trials, and, as this one leaked storyboard image shows, would probably have to find a way to get rid of a particular rabbid celebrity who seems to take form of a singing pop culture icon. Given the confirmation that Rayman could hypnotize the rabbids with song and dance, I ponder the possibility of this celebrity being very important to this story, perhaps controlling the rabbids with his use of hypnotism that Rayman would somehow learn as the game progresses. I believe this earlier set of trials is probably what inspired the final version of the game. The very start of the game might have been kind of similar to how the final game turned out, but would change afterwards as it was essentially just a tutorialized way of showing the player how to use the Wii motion controls. After a series of trials, Rayman would probably confront the celebrity, perhaps while distracted in performance to the rabid audience. If this whole idea is by any means accurate, Rayman would probably find one of the costumes that gave the host a magical dancing ability to hypnotize the rabid masses. With all this influence from one celebrity, it does bring up the question of how Jabba the Hutt, a Star Wars character spin-off confirmed for the prototype, would fit into the story. Perhaps he was the big boss while the celebrity was an informant, or perhaps some sort of sidekick. Then there's also Rayman's girlfriend, whose role is unknown. References in the final game's code point in the direction of Rayman's girlfriend being named Emily. L'Histoire de Rayman also confirms an eventual partnership between ex-Rayman 3 enemy Andre the Black Lum, who would also have a girlfriend captured by Jabba the Hutt. Due to Andre's dark nature, perhaps he would eventually double-cross Rayman and team up with the Rabbids. However, due to that being so blatantly similar to the plot of Rayman 3, that was probably seen as too cliché. All the same, it is at least a possibility. While the scenario to how Rayman could escape is up in the air, we do know that eventually he would be off on his own, as seen in the prototype screenshots. He would make his way across the apocalyptic ruins of Rayman's world by finding new ways to tackle the threat. One developing skill would be learning how to tame dangerous creatures that the Rabbids had likely also affected the ecosystem of. There is a potential plot point I've considered involving the creatures, but I'll get to that later. What I think would have been a recurring theme throughout the game was meeting Lee the Fairy, who Rayman, like in Rayman 2, would occasionally meet up with to be informed of the going-ons. At first I thought maybe Rayman would get those new magical suits from Lee to hypnotize the other variations of Rabbids, but with this spell being the work of the enemy, I'm leaning more towards Rayman finding these throughout the game. The only question is where and how. Perhaps stowed away like the masks were in Rayman 2, but this is of course just one of limitless possibilities. Upon first reuniting with Lee in the game, she would tell you more details about the Rabbid invasion, as shown in the Game Boy Advance games, and like she does in Rayman 2 with the invasion of the Robo-Pirates. She would then go on to tell Rayman that the Rabbids were a peaceful race, who were so kind that they allowed other creatures to take advantage of them. After enough abuse, they've decided to get back at everyone by capturing them and turning them into slaves of their own twisted entertainment, which would be how this whole debacle started in the first place. Rayman would then visit his home locations, which are inspired by the first Rayman game, to rid the Rabbids of their homeland and find new abilities that would help him along the way. Both the magical dances and tamed creatures would assist Rayman in finding new locations to explore, unveiling more of the story and, in tandem, more of the hidden powers Rayman would have to learn to defeat the invaders. As Rayman explores his land, he finds that the Rabbids have made great progress with their disastrous transport ships and Colossus robots lurking the land, surrounded by hordes of Machiavellian Rabbids likely ordered to locate and capture Rayman once again before he manages to foil their evil plans of taking over the world. This is where I think the trailer footage would have originated from, where Rayman pops out a can of whoop arse. I'd like to throw in a fun fact here as it's relevant in the moment. A fan known as Drewly from the Rayman PC community had once been able to recover traces of a world file remaining in the final game called Guerre des Mondes Demo, which translate to War of the Worlds Demo. Several have speculated that this is the name of the map that was demoed in the trailer. I'm not sure what, but I assume a new plot point would eventually be brought up involving the girlfriend of Rayman. After all, she does end up getting captured yet again in this other concept screen. Perhaps she still hadn't been saved yet and was brought elsewhere, but we're really just pulling loose threads together anyways. The girlfriend is being attacked by spiders here, which are of course not spiders that Rayman had managed to tame. Perhaps by this point Rabbid had decided enough was enough and it was time for his minions to kill Rayman before he ruined more of their plans for world domination. So to do so, he lures him to the girl, which was perhaps too much for the hero of this story to handle. After all, the concept image does seem to imply he's overwhelmed. With all of the Colossus robots Rayman had likely destroyed by now, and the Rabbids having taken all the spare parts from their destruction, as demonstrated in the Nintendo DS game, they will have probably managed to craft what would be the game's final boss, which I believe to be this big Mega Colossus you fight in the final game. In the Nintendo DS game, there is a portion of the game dedicated to collecting parts for a mini Rabbid UFO, which creates the same Rayman gear briefly mentioned in this video. This appears to be the same vehicle piloted by this leader Rabbid in the second trailer for the game. Perhaps Rayman would also collect parts from the ruined Colossus robots, eventually being able to build this little ship with a certain set of instructions he would have somehow obtained. This picture in the game's manual looks like it was some sort of cutscene, what with Rayman's shadow ominously teased over top of it, and this never appears in-game. If you sit idly by the final game's main menu animation, eventually you'll see a Rabbid fly past which does something very similar to the Rayman gear in the Nintendo DS game. I find this oddly suspect, but I can't place my finger on what correlation this would have had between the two, other than of course the ship looking like a Rabbid head, and here it is just that, a Rabbid head. We do see screenshots of Rayman piloting something very similar in the prototype, so Rayman would be piloting various types of Rabbid machinery. When you are finally able to pilot it, Rayman in the Nintendo DS game would shoot circular projectiles at this large fish creature. I'm not sure if this fish creature was intended for the prototype, but perhaps that was somehow related to this anglerfish? It's hard to say, especially considering the Nintendo DS game has a far more robotic looking creature than what this promo image has to show. I suppose it's possible that various land mammals would have been roboticized throughout the game, that upon being freed of their metallic exoskeletons, would befriend Rayman, being this ability of taming them, referred to by the game's developers. The Rayman series has always had a certain element of rescue to it, so this being a theme is certainly a possibility. Perhaps Rayman would be able to travel across the sea with these creatures, as there do exist files related to some sort of rideable snake creature, reminiscent of the surfing segments from Rayman 2. Some speculated this being a return of Sam the Snake, but there is no evidence of him being a returning character here. I won't deny the possibility, but we lack the information to do more than speculate. So now we have a basic plotline. It might not be completely accurate, but with all I've put together, I think most elements discussed above were planned for the game at one point or another. Hubert Chevallard is quoted in L'Histoire de Rayman, saying, "Honestly, I am very happy with the story we were going to develop." And I would be inclined to agree with him if this is how the events would pan out. But without confirmation, even these theories have no guarantee of being correct. I'm sure many ideas were scrapped here and there, so throwing it all into one cohesive story might make this a bumbling mess. But at least now we do have an idea on how some of these elements might have worked in-game. Unfortunately, this is where things go downhill, as a demanding schedule would not promise the game they were intending to make. There had been so much work on this prototype specifically because of the deadline. All you've seen and heard of this cancelled game took place within the span of 3 months, from April into June of 2006. The final nail on this coffin would be the day a certain visitor was greeted to the studio from Nintendo. An unnamed Nintendo executive visited Ubisoft Montpellier to check progress on their new game and launch title for their platform. While the meeting was friendly, the executive was not satisfied. Upon being asked for new demos, someone at the studio told him that they had nothing new to show off. It's unknown whether or not the executive ended up seeing the current status of the project, but he left that day with a strong suggestion for them. If they wanted to make the game they were setting out to make, while also emphasizing the use of their Wii controllers throughout the game, they would not have enough time to realistically achieve it. So, they were told that the best course of action for them would be to reduce the scale of the game and bring more attention to the Nintendo Wii's motion controls. Therefore, in tandem, it would be a more effective launch title for their new system. Some members took this advice with open arms, but others allegedly did not so much. The following is unknown, but many signs point to this period of development being when Michel Ancel decided to leave the project. Michel was fond of his Rabbids project, but it has been documented that when it came to changes in the game's design, he wasn't usually on board. In L'Histoire de Rayman, it had been mentioned that when Hubert Chevallard revealed his first render of the Raving Rabbids model to Michel, it actually saddened him. I would be more elaborate here, but that's all it actually says about his impression. The aftermath is documented, however, in which it states that he realized this render amused everyone around him, despite not being quite like what he had pictured in mind. There was also some sort of competition surrounding this character, which Michel had been a part of, that he did not manage to win. I would also be more elaborate on that if it said more, alas it does not. As confirmed by L'Histoire de Rayman, in June of 2006, Rayman Raving Rabbids would slowly but surely transition into an entirely party-focused game, which would be 4 months later in September. Michel Ancel was a bit of a purist in his developments for Raving Rabbids, which was a tell sign of why he would decide to leave the project once the team had decided it was time to scrap the idea and move on to a game that could be of a lesser scale, if this is indeed when his choices were made clear. The idea was then to move into a direction that more pleased Nintendo and relied far more on technological innovation for their new console. Rayman Raving Rabbids as we now know it was then underway. However, for an entirely new shift of focus with only 4 months left of development, including the debug phase, this became a concerning wake-up call for the studio. What helped make this production possible was the experience Ubisoft Montpellier had with their Jade engine that they had worked with for Beyond Good and Evil and King Kong recently before the developments of Rayman Raving Rabbids. Of course, they also still had their prototype, in which many of its developments were, as mentioned earlier, partly reintegrated into the new game to cut development time in half. In many ways, they were starting back from square one. It was how they decided to reuse their existing materials that made development fly by as smoothly as it did, considering the window of time allocated for it. L'Histoire de Rayman states that in development, the idea was for the team to create one minigame per every 2 days, with 3 days being their hard limit. This resulted in a total of 75 minigames, many of which were given second and some even third parts that were more or less the same minigames with an added difficulty curve. These basically repeated games ended up being one of the most telling signs of the game being rushed to schedule. For completionists, they would probably tell you that the most telling sign is the impossibility of unlocking a final challenge mode called the World Eclecticism Championship, that you could only get with an additional 5 points that were never made available in the game. Me personally, I look at Rayman's foot when slamming Rabbids in the Bunnies Have Natural Rhythm minigame. What the heck happened here? A fan by the name of Pock Gotten was able to hack into the game to unlock it in 2015, but this was 8 years after its initial release. Clearly the damage had already been done. That said, Rayman Raving Rabbids turned out to be one of the most successful developments for Ubisoft Montpellier, with a total of 1.2 million sales calculated for the game, 1 year and 3 months prior to its release in March of 2008. With such success came the inevitable sequel, which spawned another sequel, that afterwards spawned an entirely new series of highly successful games that you've no doubt heard of, the Rabbids. When the decision was made to create the second Rayman Raving Rabbids game, it was decided that it would be made from the ground up as a minigame collection, like the final product of their first game had turned out to be. Numerous changes were made in this transition, such as the removal of most personality types from the Rabbids, such as Clark, Pink, the Frog Rabbids, and most other variations. They were replaced for the generic white Rabbids that would, for the most part, all portray the same character, exception for the recurring Professor Barranco character, and Sergway, who is reused in Rayman Raving Rabbids 2 only. He hasn't been used since in the series and has likely been dropped entirely. The Glowbox babies have also likely suffered a similar fate. What L'Histoire de Rayman calls the X-Men of the Rabbids would be no more, as too would Michelangelo have nothing to do with any of the Rabbids games past the second. After the third game, Rayman Raving Rabbids TV Party, the series removed Rayman from it entirely, as was speculated from fans at the time due to the increasingly smaller Rayman text on the front of the two preceding retail boxes. The Rayman community has always been puzzled about this early prototype. I would say this is the Serious Sam Alpha equivalent. Maybe that would be the early Rayman Origins game, actually. In many ways, Sam and Rabbids were the two games with earlier cancelled builds that had seemed to plague my mind once or twice a year since I had first heard about them. Serious Sam's Alpha is out there now, and so my last remaining wish is for this prototype to be leaked. But the likelihood of this over a small team of Croatian developers is very small. Getting a prototype from the Ubisoft databanks? I don't think such a thing has ever been heard of. Don't get me started on EA and the original Star Wars Battlefront 3, a game so massively hyped and researched, and even coverage on that is still slow, albeit there have been some interesting developments recently. Nonetheless, there's a certain curiosity that lingers across fan communities with media they had been interested in at one time or another. That interest usually doesn't die, so it's like we've been waiting for a game in development since the first trailer came out. That feeling kinda sucks, even more so when you realize you may never get it. But it most certainly brings a community together, and as such, many users have made collaborative efforts to learn more about the prototype. Pock Gotten is a particular person of interest because they've posted a multitude of different scrap material from the game. One such example would be a dedicated full-body awareness first-person mode that uses a custom walking animation, however was created and scrapped for unknown reasons. A lot of Rayman's original moveset can be discovered on Pock Gotten's channel, where they've posted a number of assembly code swap videos to demonstrate these scrapped abilities. I recommend you check it out because some stuff there is really interesting to say the least. There is another Rayman fan of interest, being Framerater, who seems to have made 2 videos on the topic. Oh wait. My first video is really nothing interesting anymore in my opinion, but a video I made less than a year ago is definitely worth a revisit. After I've looked through all the work I've done towards this video, I can say that in the context of intentions, the 2 Handheld games are not prequels. Well, they weren't made to be. I suppose it's possible that this was intended as they cleaned up the console game to follow it, and perhaps releasing it a few days before the console game was a way of obscuring a hint, but it all seems to be a bit of a stretch. Those 2 games I now see to be more iterations of the prototype. The Game Boy Advance version does not follow the original Rayman 4 idea, as it follows what the prototype was intending to be when assets were shifted. The Nintendo DS version is more or less an original retelling of the events from the Game Boy Advance version, although the storytelling had been dramatically underdeveloped here and is practically non-existent. However, I do think it holds up as a poor man's interpretation of what the prototype could have been on a much larger scale. Rayman treks around his world to find costumes and fight the Rabbids alongside their massive machinery. As per why Rayman's involvement with his origins are also non-existent here, that's where I think this is an original retelling. The basics are there, the Rabbids had taken over and are using their robotic knowledge to terrorize the land, but beyond that the similarities lie in the enemy design, which is for many parts the same as the prototype. The use of costumes is akin as well, but their impact on the world may have been different here. I don't know if these costumes ever had an effect on fire, ice, explosives, or clouds. All we know is that they were used for hypnotic dance. Of the other noteworthy discoveries post-release on Rayman Raving Rabbids, I did want to bring a small bit of attention to the ending cinematic of Raving Rabbids Travel in Time. Whether it be a simple reuse of assets or not, there exists a cameo from one of the Rabbid ships in the prototype, which actually interacts with the Rabbid in the same way it did back then. It seems more fit to the comedy of the game, as just afterwards we see Professor Barranco from Rayman Raving Rabbids 2 make a reappearance, teaching the Rabbids of his plans for world domination. The Rabbid protagonist you would have played as during the game interferes and essentially foils the plot, which makes Barranco very angry. My question is whether or not this is tied to the prototype at all. Again, it could just be a reuse of existing assets, but it feels so out of place to be an otherwise random idea. We don't know if the people who worked on the story for this game had anything to do with the prototype, so for now all that can really be done is appreciate it as an extra look at the infamous Rabbid ship. In the end, the Rayman Raving Rabbids prototype remains a bit of an enigma, but I hope this video has helped to solve a lot of the confusion surrounding it and clear up a lot of the theories. This video took a very long time to make, and it had a budget. Hundreds of dollars actually went to the research of this one, so if it's at all possible, I would always greatly appreciate new channel memberships or donations to the Patreon to help balance things out. By no means is it required, Framerater content is free for all to enjoy, but without you guys I'd be stuck out there with a minimum wage job, mostly unable to create content. Even now, I'm actually making far less than minimum, and to be honest, I kinda need that support. But I don't want to make that a focus for this video. All the time I'd spent on it was genuinely in the best interest of the community as both a passion project and a love letter from me to the Rayman fans. It's a conclusion. I don't think I'll be making any more Rayman Raving Rabbids videos after this because there's nothing left to really talk about. Unless more content is revealed, then this is it. However, I will still always be taking a look at past and present Rayman content and intend to make many more videos about the series. While Rayman is far from seeing his end here on Framerater, the Rabbids have finally chewed their last carrot.